John Parker's life had been quiet since his wife Melanie passed away 5 years earlier. He spent most of his days working on small projects around his modest ranch-style home in Springfield, Missouri. The house sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by open fields and the occasional cluster of oak trees. It was a simple life, the kind that left plenty of time for reflection and, sometimes, for loneliness to creep in. Yet, as quiet as his days had become, fate had a way of changing everything when one least expected it. It all began on a day that started like any other. John was sitting in the local diner, a cozy, time-worn place where he and Melanie had once shared Saturday morning pancakes, lost in thought while sipping his coffee. The familiar clink of cutlery and murmur of conversation filled the background as he gazed out the window. Suddenly, a headline in the day-old newspaper caught his eye. The bold print declared, "Local tragedy claims young parents, 2 children left behind." John read the article twice. It told the heartbreaking story of a terrible car accident just outside of town in which Caleb, aged 10, and Mason, aged 7, had lost their parents. No close relatives had stepped forward to claim them, and now the 2 children were in the foster care system. John set the paper down and stared out at the diner parking lot, feeling a heavy ache settle in his chest, a pain that was not fleeting but long and deep. In that moment, memories of Melanie flooded back. He recalled the many times they had dreamed of having children, and how Melanie would often say, "If we can't have our own, maybe we're meant to help someone who needs us." Her gentle, encouraging voice seemed to echo in the quiet of the diner, even though she was long gone. 2 weeks later, John found himself sitting in his lawyer's office with a stack of adoption papers spread across the desk. It was a decision he had never expected to make, yet as the idea took root, he realized there was no turning back. He wasn't just adopting 2 boys, he was opening his home and his heart to a future that he could not fully predict. As John signed his name on the dotted line, the lawyer, an older man with graying hair, raised an eyebrow and said, "You know, folks around here are gonna talk. You sure about this?" John's hand paused for a brief moment, then he continued writing with firm resolve. "Let them talk," he murmured. By the time he walked out of the office, the paperwork complete, a mixture of fear and determination swirled within him. For the first time in years, John realized that he was not merely existing, he had found a new purpose. The first meeting with Caleb and Mason took place at the local children's home, a brick building on the outskirts of Springfield. The air inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and cafeteria food, and the soft hum of children's chatter echoed down the long hallways. John sat on a plastic chair with his hands resting on his knees, waiting nervously. When the boys finally walked in, he immediately stood. Caleb, the older of the 2, entered first. His dark, cautious eyes scanned the room before settling on John. At just 10 years old, Caleb already carried a heaviness in his posture, as if the weight of the world rested on his small shoulders. Behind him, little Mason clung to his brother's shirt, his small steps hesitant, yet curious. "Hi, boys," John said gently, his voice steady despite the nervous energy thrumming within him. "I'm John Parker." Caleb did not reply immediately. He studied John, as if trying to decide whether this man was simply another temporary adult passing through his life. Meanwhile, Mason whispered something to Caleb, and after a brief, subtle nod, Caleb finally asked in a quiet, steady tone, "Are you really going to take both of us?" John knelt down to meet Caleb's eye level and said firmly, "That's the only way this works. You and Mason come as a package deal." Mason peeked out from behind Caleb, his lips trembling as he asked in an almost inaudible voice, "For how long?" "For good," John replied, the weight of his words sinking deeply into the room. "This isn't just for now. I'm here for the long haul. You boys are going to have a home with me." The promise hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment the boys seemed uncertain whether to believe him, but then something shifted. Mason released his grip on Caleb's shirt and stepped forward, his small hand reaching out. John did not hesitate. He gently took Mason's hand in his own, feeling the fragility and trust conveyed in that simple gesture. The ride home was quiet, punctuated only by the rhythmic crunch of gravel under the truck's tires. Caleb and Mason sat closely together in the back seat, their small backpacks clutched tightly as if to hold on to their past. John glanced at them in the rearview mirror, feeling his chest tighten with a mixture of protectiveness and uncertainty. When the truck finally pulled into the driveway, Mason spoke for the first time since leaving the children's home. "It's big," he said softly, looking at the house. "It's home," John replied simply, leading the boys inside. He showed them their shared bedroom, a small but cozy space with matching twin beds and a window that overlooked the backyard. Caleb carefully set his backpack down, his eyes quietly surveying the room, while Mason immediately jumped onto one of the beds, bouncing slightly on the mattress. After a moment, John cleared his throat and addressed the boys. "Listen, I know this is all new and may be a little scary," he said in a low, steady voice, "but I want you to know something important. This isn't temporary. This is your home now, and I'll be here for you no matter what." Caleb's jaw tightened momentarily, and for a brief second John thought the boy might push back. But then Caleb gave a small nod. Mason, barely above a whisper, murmured, "Promise." "Promise," John replied firmly. In that instant, he knew he had made the right decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first few weeks tested John in ways he had never anticipated. Caleb and Mason had already endured more in their short lives than most adults could imagine. Caleb, the older brother, kept his emotions locked away, speaking only when spoken to directly. Mason, on the other hand, was full of nervous energy, prone to sudden tears or bursts of laughter that seemed more like a way to cope than an expression of genuine joy. And then there was the town itself. Springfield was not the kind of place where secrets stayed buried. Whispers started almost immediately. At the grocery store, a neighbor glanced at John's shopping cart, filled with snacks and kids' cereals, with an expression of equal parts surprise and judgment. At church, the congregation buzzed when John walked in with the boys, their young faces stark against a sea of familiar ones. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into overt acts. The local hardware store suddenly did not have the paint John needed for the boys' room, and at a nearby diner, every booth was mysteriously reserved when John and the boys arrived for breakfast. At town council meetings, people spoke in hushed, coded tones about unconventional families and preserving the community's way of life. One afternoon, while Caleb and Mason were playing basketball in the driveway, an older couple walked by. Their eyes narrowed at the sight, and the man muttered something to his wife, loud enough for Caleb to hear. "He'll regret it." John, who had been cleaning tools in the garage, stepped outside just as Caleb froze mid-dribble. Although the boy's face remained carefully blank, John could see the tension in his shoulders. He walked over and placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Don't listen to them," John said steadily. "Some people talk because they don't know how to think. You're here because you belong here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Caleb nodded, though John could tell the boy was struggling to fully believe his words. Nighttime was the hardest. Mason began having vivid, terrifying nightmares that sent him running into John's room in tears. The first time it happened, John sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arm protectively around Mason's trembling frame. "Is it about the accident?" he asked gently. Mason nodded, burying his face in John's chest. "I miss them," he whispered. "I know you do," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay to miss them. It's okay to feel sad. But I'm here now, Mason. You're not alone." Mason clung even tighter to him, and for the first time, John felt as though he was beginning to break through the walls that the boys had built around their hearts. Caleb, however, was a different story. He carried himself with a quiet toughness that made it hard for John to discern his inner feelings. One evening, as John was fixing a broken step on the porch, Caleb approached him, holding a small wooden box. "What's this?" John asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. Caleb hesitated before handing over the box. Inside were photographs, a mix of family pictures and candid snapshots of his parents. "I don't want Mason to see these yet," Caleb said quietly. "He's not ready." John nodded carefully, closing the box. "You're a good big brother," he said softly. "You take care of him." Caleb merely shrugged, though there was a subtle flicker in his eyes, perhaps a mix of pride and the quiet acceptance of responsibility. Despite all the struggles, there were small victories. Mason began laughing more. Genuine, hearty laughter that filled the house with warmth. Caleb, though usually reserved, started showing interest in John's carpentry projects. He would watch intently as John explained how to sand and stain wood. Slowly but surely, the boys began to heal, and for the first time in a long while, John felt a glimmer of hope. That spring, which came early that year, brought with it warmer days and brighter skies. John saw it as the perfect opportunity to help the boys integrate into the community. Despite lingering skepticism around town, he signed them up for youth sports, Caleb for basketball and Mason for soccer, and made plans for them to all pitch in at the upcoming town cleanup day. The first game day, however, did not go as smoothly as John had hoped. Caleb, wearing his freshly issued basketball jersey, stepped onto the court with his team, only to be met with stares from the parents on the sidelines. John noticed their whispered conversations and sideways glances, their eyes darting between Caleb and him. As the game began, Caleb's talent quickly became apparent. He was fast, precise, and utterly focused. By halftime, even the most skeptical parents had to acknowledge his skill. Yet, despite this recognition, the air still felt thick with tension, as if old prejudices lingered just beneath the surface. After the game, as Caleb walked off the court, John noticed a man wearing a baseball cap approach him with a skeptical expression. The man extended his hand and said gruffly, "He's got real talent. You must be proud." John shook the man's hand firmly and replied, "I am. He's worked hard." Although their conversation was brief, it signified the beginning of a slow change in attitudes. At the town cleanup day, volunteers gathered in the town square armed with brooms, garbage bags, and gloves. John and the boys joined a group tasked with repainting the gazebo in the local park. As they worked, Mason's light-hearted chatter filled the air, drawing smiles from several older volunteers. "Mr. Parker," said one woman, wiping her hands on her apron as she took a break, "Mason really knows how to make work feel a little lighter. He's such a bright kid." John smiled as he watched Mason laugh while trying to paint a straight line along the railing. Caleb, ever the diligent worker, fixed a wobbly bench with care, earning a nod of approval from one of the older men. Meanwhile, Mason managed to rally a small group of neighborhood kids to help clean up trash around the park. By the end of the day, it was clear that the atmosphere had shifted. People were no longer simply tolerating John and his boys. They were beginning to see them as part of the community. The true turning point came when Mason entered the town's annual Spring Festival art contest. For days, he had poured his heart into a painting of his late parents, a tender, heartfelt tribute that captured the warmth and love they had shared. On the day of the festival, Mason's painting was hung in the town square alongside those of other local artists. People stopped to admire his work, their expressions softening as they took in the emotion behind each brushstroke. When the winners were announced, Mason's name rang out through the square, met with genuine applause. As Mason walked up to receive his ribbon, John saw something change in the crowd. For the first time, the whispers of judgment began to fade, replaced by smiles of admiration and acceptance. That evening, as the family walked home together, Caleb spoke quietly. "It feels different." "What do you mean?" John asked. "People aren't looking at us the same way," Caleb replied, glancing back at the brightly lit town square. "That's because they're starting to see what I see. Two amazing kids who belong here," John said with a smile, feeling his heart lift. One late afternoon, as a distant rumble signaled an approaching storm, the kind the local news had warned about for days, the sky turned a bruised grey and the winds picked up, bending the trees in John's backyard. Caleb and Mason stood by the living room window, their faces a mixture of fascination and fear. "Will it be bad?" Mason asked in a whisper. John put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Storms can be tough, but this house has stood through worse. We'll be okay." Moments later, the power flickered and went out completely. John grabbed a flashlight and led the boys to the basement, where the relentless sound of rain pounding on the roof and the occasional snap of breaking branches filled the air. Caleb sat close to Mason, wrapping his arm protectively around his younger brother. When the storm finally passed, John led the boys upstairs to assess the damage. They stepped outside to find shingles scattered across the yard, branches strewn everywhere, and a portion of the fence leaning precariously across the street. A neighbor's roof had partially caved in, and the sound of sirens filled the air as emergency vehicles navigated the flooded streets. John took a deep breath and turned to the boys. "Let's get to work," he said firmly. "There are people out there who need help." The next few days became a blur of activity. John and the boys spent every waking moment assisting neighbors with repairs. They cleared fallen branches, hammered plywood over broken windows, and distributed supplies from the community center. Mason quickly became a favorite among the neighbors, his cheerful demeanor offering a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. At one point, he handed a bottle of water to an elderly woman who patted his cheek and said, "You've got a good heart, young man." Caleb worked quietly yet tirelessly, his focus unshakable as he helped John patch up roofs and secure unstable structures. One gruff neighbor, who had barely spoken to John before, stopped by to offer a simple compliment. "You're raising good boys," John replied. "I'm just helping them be who they already are." The storm had brought the town together in unexpected ways. People who had once kept their distance now worked side by side with John and the boys at a community potluck organized to thank the volunteers. During that potluck, as the mayor took the stage to give a speech, he singled out John Parker and his sons. "In times like these, we see the true character of people," he declared. "John Parker and his boys have shown us what it means to care for others, no matter the circumstances." The applause was thunderous, and for the first time, John felt as though the town had truly accepted his family. That night, while sitting around a dining table eating leftover potluck dishes, Mason looked up at John and asked softly, "Do you think Mom and Dad would have been proud of us?" John set his fork down, his throat tightening as he replied, "I know they would have been, and I'm proud of you both." Caleb glanced at Mason, then at John, and added, "We're proud of you too." The simple words carried a weight that made John's heart swell with emotion. In the weeks that followed the storm, the Parker family's efforts began to change attitudes in Springfield. People who had once avoided them now waved as they passed, and the murmurs of disapproval slowly turned into warm conversations about the family's contributions. One Saturday, while Caleb and Mason played basketball in the driveway, a car pulled up. It was Mr. Peterson, one of the town's more vocal critics. He stepped out holding a small toolbox and said, "I heard you're fixing that old gazebo down at the park. Thought you might need an extra pair of hands." John hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand and said, "We could use the help." That afternoon, Caleb worked alongside Mr. Peterson, sanding the gazebo rails, while Mason helped apply a fresh coat of paint. By the end of the day, the once dilapidated structure gleamed, and Mr. Peterson stayed long enough to share lemonade with the family on their porch. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step toward reconciliation. Caleb's basketball team later organized a fundraiser to help families still recovering from the storm, and Mason suggested that part of the proceeds be donated to repair the community center's playground. When Mason presented his idea to the group, a few kids hesitated. "What if we don't raise enough?" one boy asked. Mason grinned and said, "Then we'll keep going until we do." The fundraiser was a success, and the sight of Mason handing over a check to the community center director softened even the hardest of hearts. At a subsequent town council meeting, an older woman known as Mrs. Aldridge, whose sharp tongue was well known, voiced her concerns, saying, "I still think this is all too much, too fast." Her pointed words, however, seemed to lose their edge when Caleb raised his hand and said simply, "People can change. If we can, so can you." The room fell silent, and even Mrs. Aldridge sank back into her seat looking thoughtful. The true moment of transformation for the town came during the annual 4th of July celebration. Families gathered from all over Springfield for the fireworks display, and John, Caleb, and Mason arrived early to help set up chairs and tables. As the sun set, the park filled with excited chatter and anticipation. When the fireworks began, Mason sat on John's lap, his face illuminated by bursts of light, while Caleb sat beside them, his expression a mix of awe and quiet contentment. As the final firework exploded in a shower of gold and silver, John looked around at the crowd and felt for the first time that they were not just tolerating him and his boys. They were part of the town. Mason leaned his head against John's chest and whispered, "We belong here, don't we?" John smiled with misty eyes and replied, "Yeah, buddy, we do." 10 years later, Springfield had changed in many ways. New businesses had sprouted up, and the once crumbling playground had transformed into a bustling hub of activity. The gazebo that Caleb and Mason had helped restore still stood as a proud symbol of resilience. John Parker's house had evolved into a warm gathering place where neighbors felt welcome and children played basketball in the driveway. His sons, now grown men, had carved out meaningful lives for themselves while still carrying the lessons learned in that little house at the end of the gravel road. Caleb, now 20, was studying architecture at the University of Kansas. He often returned home on weekends to help with community projects, his innovative designs breathing new life into old structures. His latest project was a town mural featuring images of the storm and the recovery that followed, a tribute to the unity that had blossomed in its aftermath. Mason, 17, had taken a different path, using his natural charisma and gift for connecting with people to lead youth outreach programs at the local community center. He worked tirelessly to ensure that children from all backgrounds had opportunities to thrive by offering mentorship and organizing events that bridged divides. One warm summer evening, the town gathered for a dedication ceremony at the community center. A plaque was unveiled in honor of the Parker family for teaching the community what it meant to care for one another. John stood at the back of the crowd, his arms folded as he watched his sons speak. Caleb spoke passionately about the importance of creating spaces that brought people together, while Mason shared touching stories about the children he had mentored and the difference that a little kindness could make. When the speeches ended, Caleb found John near the food tables and said quietly, "We couldn't have done any of this without you." John shook his head and replied in a low voice, "No, son. You both made your own paths. I just gave you the tools." As the crowd dispersed, Mason walked over carrying 2 plates of pie. "I saved the last pieces for us," he said with a grin. John chuckled and took a plate, thinking that some things truly never change. The 3 of them sat on a bench near the playground, sharing a quiet meal in comfortable silence. That night, as the sky darkened and the first stars twinkled faintly above, Caleb whispered softly, "I think Mum would have been proud of us." John looked at his son, his chest swelling with pride, and replied, "She would have been. And so am I." For a long moment they sat in silence, the distant sounds of laughter and conversation a gentle reminder of how far they had come. Caleb and Mason had grown into men of character and compassion, leaving behind a legacy of their own. John realized that the house he had built was more than just a home for 2 boys. It was a foundation for a better future, one that would ripple far beyond Springfield. John knelt down to meet Caleb's eye level and said firmly, "That's the only way this works. You and Mason come as a package deal." Mason peeked out from behind Caleb, his lips trembling as he asked in an almost inaudible voice, "For how long?" "For good," John replied, the weight of his words sinking deeply into the room. "This isn't just for now. I'm here for the long haul. You boys are going to have a home with me." The promise hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, the boys seemed uncertain whether to believe him. But then something shifted. Mason released his grip on Caleb's shirt and stepped forward, his small hand reaching out. John did not hesitate. He gently took Mason's hand in his own, feeling the fragility and trust conveyed in that simple gesture. The ride home was quiet, punctuated only by the rhythmic crunch of gravel under the truck's tires. Caleb and Mason sat closely together in the back seat, their small backpacks clutched tightly as if to hold on to their past. John glanced at them in the rearview mirror, feeling his chest tighten with a mixture of protectiveness and uncertainty. When the truck finally pulled into the driveway, Mason spoke for the first time since leaving the children's home. "It's big," he said softly, looking at the house. "It's home," John replied simply, leading the boys inside. He showed them their shared bedroom, a small but cozy space with matching twin beds and a window that overlooked the backyard. Caleb carefully set his backpack down, his eyes quietly surveying the room, while Mason immediately jumped onto one of the beds, bouncing slightly on the mattress. After a moment, John cleared his throat and addressed the boys. "Listen, I know this is all new and maybe a little scary," he said in a low, steady voice, "but I want you to know something important. This isn't temporary. This is your home now, and I'll be here for you no matter what." Caleb's jaw tightened momentarily, and for a brief second, John thought the boy might push back. But then Caleb gave a small nod. Mason, barely above a whisper, murmured, "Promise, promise," John replied firmly. In that instant, he knew he had made the right decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first few weeks tested John in ways he had never anticipated. Caleb and Mason had already endured more in their short lives than most adults could imagine. Caleb, the older brother, kept his emotions locked away, speaking only when spoken to directly. Mason, on the other hand, was full of nervous energy, prone to sudden tears or bursts of laughter that seemed more like a way to cope than an expression of genuine joy. And then there was the town itself. Springfield was not the kind of place where secrets stayed buried. Whispers started almost immediately. At the grocery store, a neighbor glanced at John's shopping cart, filled with snacks and kids' cereals, with an expression of equal parts surprise and judgment. At church, the congregation buzzed when John walked in with the boys, their young faces stark against a sea of familiar ones. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into overt acts. The local hardware store suddenly did not have the paint John needed for the boys' room, and at a nearby diner, every booth was mysteriously reserved when John and the boys arrived for breakfast. At town council meetings, people spoke in hushed, coded tones about unconventional families and preserving the community's way of life. One afternoon, while Caleb and Mason were playing basketball in the driveway, an older couple walked by. Their eyes narrowed at the sight, and the man muttered something to his wife, loud enough for Caleb to hear, "You'll regret it." John, who had been cleaning tools in the garage, stepped outside just as Caleb froze mid-dribble. Although the boy's face remained carefully blank, John could see the tension in his shoulders. He walked over and placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Don't listen to them," John said steadily. "Some people talk because they don't know how to think. You're here because you belong here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Caleb nodded, though John could tell the boy was struggling to fully believe his words. Nighttime was the hardest. Mason began having vivid, terrifying nightmares that sent him running into John's room in tears. The first time it happened, John sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arm protectively around Mason's trembling frame. "Is it about the accident?" he asked gently. Mason nodded, burying his face in John's chest. "I miss them," he whispered. "I know you do," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay to miss them. It's okay to feel sad. But I'm here now, Mason. You're not alone." Mason clung even tighter to him, and for the first time, John felt as though he was beginning to break through the walls that the boys had built around their hearts. Caleb, however, was a different story. He carried himself with a quiet toughness that made it hard for John to discern his inner feelings. One evening, as John was fixing a broken step on the porch, Caleb approached him, holding a small wooden box. "What's this?" John asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. Caleb hesitated before handing over the box. Inside were photographs, a mix of family pictures and candid snapshots of his parents. "I don't want Mason to see these yet," Caleb said quietly. "He's not ready." John nodded carefully, closing the box. "You're a good big brother," he said softly. "You take care of him." Caleb merely shrugged, though there was a subtle flicker in his eyes. Perhaps a mix of pride and the quiet acceptance of responsibility.